want to start with a number. Not a dramatic one, just a number. 7. 7 days. That's how long it took. 7 days between the moment my oncologist said the words, aggressive malignancy, poor prognosis, and the moment my phone lit up with a notification from a law firm I had never heard of, informing me that my husband of 11 years had retained counsel and initiated divorce proceedings. I was still in the middle of pre-treatment testing when that notification arrived. There was a needle in my arm. A nurse was labeling vials on the counter across the room, her back to me, humming something under her breath. The fluorescent light above me had a faint flicker that I had been staring at for 20 minutes. And my phone, face up on the chair beside me, showed me a message from an attorney named Gerald Watts on behalf of his client, Michael Delaney. His client. My husband. I stared at it for a long time. Long enough for the nurse to finish labeling, turn around, and ask if I was all right. I told her I was fine. That is what you say when you are so far from fine that the word has lost its shape entirely. You say it anyway, because the alternative is explaining something you don't have language for yet. Here is what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not telling it from a hospital bed. I am not telling it from the dark. I'm telling it from the other side of something that should have broken me and did not, though it came close. Closer than the cancer ever did, and that is saying something. I am alive. My children are with me. And what happened in the space between that fluorescent-lit room and where I am now is the thing I need to tell you about. My name is Laura. I'm 41 years old. And the day Michael filed for divorce was the day I decided, quietly, without telling anyone, without drama, that I was not going to let him be right about me. He had calculated that I was running out of time. He had looked at the numbers the doctor laid out and decided they were a reasonable exit ramp. He had done the math on my survival and concluded that the investment wasn't worth it. I want you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further, because I think it's important to name it plainly. My husband of 11 years looked at my illness and saw a liability. And then he acted accordingly. But here's the thing about people who make that kind of calculation. They are usually right about the math and wrong about the person. And Michael, it turned out, had never really known me at all. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the marriage, though we'll get there, but the beginning of the week that changed everything. Because 7 days is a very short amount of time to watch someone reveal exactly who they are. And I saw every single day of it. Before I tell you about the 7 days, I need to tell you about the 11 years. Because context matters. Because the betrayal only makes sense if you understand what I believed we had. Michael and I met at 28. I was working as an operations manager for a mid-sized logistics company, and he was 3 years into running his own consulting firm. Small, scrappy, built on handshakes and late nights, and the specific energy of someone who genuinely believed he was going somewhere. I admired that. I came from a family where ambition was treated with suspicion, where wanting more than what you had was considered a kind of ingratitude. So when I met someone who wore his drive openly, like it was the most natural thing in the world, I found it magnetic. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive in the beginning, the kind of attentive that, when you're in it, feels like being truly seen. He remembered things, small things, the name of my college roommate, the coffee order I'd had since sophomore year, the fact that I couldn't sleep in a room without some kind of ambient noise. He paid attention, and after years of feeling like I was moving through rooms where no one quite noticed me, that attention felt like water after a long drought. We got married on a Saturday in September, outdoors, at a vineyard about 90 minutes outside the city. My mother cried. His mother made a speech that was mostly about him, which I noted and then set aside because you set things aside when you are 29 and in love, and the afternoon is golden and everything feels like it is exactly as it should be. We had our first child, a son named Cooper, 18 months later. Our second, a daughter named Ellie, 3 years after that. And somewhere in the space between Cooper's birth and Ellie's second birthday, Michael's consulting firm grew into something real. An actual company, with actual employees, with a name on a lease and a line of credit and quarterly projections. And I was part of that. Not as an employee, we kept it informal, always, but as the person who helped him build the operational structure, who reviewed contracts, who talked through decisions at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed. I put years of thinking into that business. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. The life we had looked, from the outside, like the life you work toward. Good neighborhood, good schools, date nights on Fridays when we could manage it, vacations that we planned in January and looked forward to all year. We argued sometimes about money, about the balance between his work and family time, about the small accumulated resentments that every long marriage carries like sediment. But I believed, genuinely and without irony, that we were solid, that we were the kind of couple that would be difficult and worth it and still standing at the end. I believed that all the way up to the day I sat in the oncologist's office and felt Michael squeeze my hand and heard him say, "We'll get through this." I believed it for 7 more days after that. And then the notification came, and I understood that I had been living inside a version of my marriage that only existed on my side of it. There was one moment, one specific moment, that I keep coming back to now. It was maybe 3 years into the marriage. We were at a dinner party at a friend's house, and someone mentioned that a mutual acquaintance's wife had been diagnosed with MS. The table went quiet in that particular way tables go quiet when someone says something that brings mortality into a room uninvited. And Michael, without missing a beat, without any particular weight to the words, said, "I'm just not built for that kind of thing. Hospitals, long-term illness. I don't have that in me." Everyone laughed a little, the way you laugh when someone says something that is either very honest or very uncomfortable and you haven't decided which. I laughed too. I thought he was being self-deprecating. I thought it was a joke. I filed it under things people say at dinner parties and moved on. I have thought about that moment every single day for the past year. Because it was not a joke. It was not self-deprecation. It was a man telling a room full of people exactly who he was, and every single one of us smiled and passed the bread and did not listen. The first symptom was fatigue. Not the kind of tired that comes from not sleeping enough or taking on too much. I knew what that felt like. I had 2 kids and a half share in a growing business. This was different. This was a heaviness that sat below the surface of everything, that didn't lift with sleep or coffee or a slow Saturday morning. This was my body sending a signal on a frequency I didn't have the equipment to read yet. I mentioned it to my primary care doctor in February. She ran blood work. Thyroid, iron, B12, the usual panel for a woman in her late 30s who complains of fatigue. Everything came back within normal range. She said I might be dealing with stress-related exhaustion, which was a reasonable explanation because my life at that point was genuinely demanding, and I had not been particularly kind to myself about rest. I accepted that explanation because it was available, and because the alternative, sitting with the possibility that something was actually wrong, required an energy I didn't have. By April, the fatigue had company, a dull ache in my side that came and went without pattern. I am the kind of person who does not run to the doctor for pain that cannot be clearly located, and so I waited. I told myself it was muscular. I told myself I had probably slept wrong. I told myself a lot of things that April, and none of them were true. It was Michael who finally pushed me to go back. I want to give him that, because fairness matters to me even now, even after everything. We were in the kitchen on a Tuesday night, kids already in bed, and I was standing at the counter, not doing anything in particular, just standing there in a way that apparently looked wrong to him. He said my name, and I turned around, and something in my face made him cross the room. He said, "When did you last actually feel okay? Not fine. Okay." And I thought about it and couldn't immediately answer, which told us both something. I called the doctor the next morning. She ordered imaging. I went alone because I told Michael it was probably nothing and I didn't want him to take time off work for probably nothing. The radiologist's face, reading the scan in real time, was carefully neutral in the way that faces are carefully neutral when they are working very hard not to be something else. She told me she would send the results to my doctor. She told me to expect a call within 48 hours. She told me to try not to worry, which is a thing people say when worrying is exactly the appropriate response. The call came in 36 hours. My doctor asked if I could come in and could I bring someone with me. Those 7 words, "Could you bring someone with you?" are the words that change the shape of a day. I knew, sitting on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand, that I was no longer dealing with stress-related exhaustion. I knew, the way you know things that you cannot yet say out loud. I called Michael. He left work early. He drove me to the appointment without turning on the radio, which was unusual. He almost always had something on. We sat in the waiting room, and he held my hand, and I looked at a poster on the wall about the importance of annual checkups. And I thought about Cooper's baseball practice that evening, and whether anyone had remembered to take the chicken out of the freezer. The mind does that. It goes somewhere manageable, while the rest of you prepares for something it isn't sure it can handle. The oncologist's name was Dr. Patricia Wren. She was direct in the way that good doctors who deliver bad news learn to be direct. Not cold, not clinical, but clear. She did not make me wait. She showed me the imaging, walked me through what she was seeing, and used language that was precise without being brutal. Aggressive malignancy. The location. The size. The fact that it had likely been developing for some time before presenting symptomatically. The treatment protocol she wanted to begin. The prognosis, which she gave me carefully, in ranges rather than absolutes, because she was a person who understood that numbers are not prophecy. Michael sat beside me the entire time. He asked 2 questions, reasonable questions, about treatment timelines, about side effects. Dr. Wren answered them. And when we walked out of that office into the parking lot, into the ordinary September afternoon that had continued happening outside while our lives rearranged themselves, he put his arm around me and he said, "We'll get through this." 7 days later, I received a notification from Gerald Watts, attorney at law. I have replayed that week so many times that I have worn grooves in it. I know every day of it the way you know the layout of a house you grew up in. Not because you're trying to remember, but because the memory is structural, built into you. Day 1 was shock. The pure, disorienting shock of a diagnosis like that, which does not fully arrive all at once, but keeps arriving, in waves, in quiet moments, at unexpected angles. Michael was present that day. He sat with me through the afternoon. He told the kids something vague about Mommy having to see some extra doctors for a while. He ordered dinner because neither of us was capable of cooking. He held me when I cried at 11 o'clock that night, and I fell asleep thinking, okay, this is terrible, but we are going to do this together. Day 2 was when I first noticed something off. Nothing I could name, just a quality of distraction in him that felt different from grief-adjacent shock. He took 3 phone calls in the other room. Long ones. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he said work, which was plausible and which I accepted because I had enough to process without adding suspicion to the pile. Day 3, he was quieter. He brought me coffee in the morning, the way he sometimes did on weekends, and the gesture was familiar and kind and somehow hollow. The way a gesture can be kind and hollow at the same time when something underneath has shifted. He avoided my eyes at dinner. He put the kids to bed. That part he did without being asked, and afterward said he had some emails to get through and went to the office at the back of the house and closed the door. Day 4. This is the day I cannot think about without something tightening in my chest, even now. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the morning, just the 2 of us, kids already at school. He had a notepad in front of him, the yellow legal kind he always used for anything he considered serious, and he asked me, in a careful, measured tone, whether I had looked at the life insurance policy recently, whether I knew what it covered, whether the house was in both our names or just one. I told him the house was in both our names. I told him I hadn't looked at the life insurance recently. I told him those were probably smart things to get clear on. I told myself he was being practical. I told myself that some people respond to fear by organizing, by trying to get their hands around the logistical shape of a situation, and that was what this was. I was wrong. But I didn't know that yet. And even if some part of me suspected, the rest of me was not ready to know it. Day 5, he left in the morning, saying he had back-to-back client meetings and would be home by 7. He came home at 10:15. He said the meetings ran over. He did not offer details, and I did not ask for them because I was exhausted from a pre-treatment appointment that had taken most of the afternoon, and I did not have the bandwidth for a conversation that required me to read between lines. Day 6, he was almost entirely absent, in the way a person can be absent while still physically present. One-word answers. A phone kept face down on every surface. The specific, studied neutrality of someone who is keeping something in. I asked him once, that evening, if he was okay. He said yes. He said he was just trying to process everything. I said I understood, and I did. Grief has strange shapes, and I was not going to demand that his look like mine. That was the last real conversation we had as a married couple. Day 7, a Thursday. I was at the cancer center for blood work, the first round of pre-treatment baseline testing, the kind where they fill what feels like an unreasonable number of vials and label them with a precision that makes you feel both cared for and very clinical at once. The nurse was at the counter. The light was flickering. My phone was on the chair beside me. The notification came at 11:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I looked at it immediately, the way you look at your phone when it lights up unexpectedly, the reflex of it. Gerald Watts, attorney at law. In the matter of Delaney versus Delaney. Delaney versus Delaney. I read it twice. Then I read it again. The nurse turned around and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. She went back to labeling vials. I sat very still for a long time. Outside the window, there was an ordinary parking lot and an ordinary gray sky, and somewhere out there was a man I had been married to for 11 years who had looked at the mathematics of my survival and decided they didn't add up for him. I did not cry. I want to tell you that because I think it matters, not as evidence of strength, but as evidence of something that had gone past the place where tears are the right language. What I felt in that moment was not sadness. It was clarity. Cold, flat, total clarity. He thought I was going to die, and he had decided to get out before that happened. What he had not accounted for was that I had decided otherwise. I waited until the nurse finished and left the room before I called him. I don't know exactly why, some instinct toward privacy maybe, or toward not performing whatever this conversation was going to be in front of a witness. I sat in the chair with the small bandage on the inside of my elbow where the needle had been, and I found his name in my contacts, and I pressed call. He answered on the 4th ring. I'd been counting. He said, "Hey." Just that. Hey. In the specific tone of someone who has been expecting a call they are not prepared to have. I said I had received a notification from a Gerald Watts. I said I wanted to understand what that meant. I kept my voice level, not because I felt level, but because leveling my voice was the only thing in that moment that I could control, and I was going to control it. There was a pause. 4 seconds, maybe 5. I have thought about those seconds a lot. I think he had a version of this conversation prepared, something measured and reasonable, something that framed what he had done as a mutual and practical decision. I think the version he had prepared did not account for how calm I sounded. Calm people are harder to manage than upset ones, and Michael had always been better at managing than at being honest. He said, "I've been thinking a lot this week." He said, "This isn't something I decided lightly." He said, "I have to be honest with you," which is a phrase people use when they are about to say something they know is wrong and want credit for saying it anyway. He said he wasn't built for this. That phrase again. The dinner party phrase. The phrase he had said 3 years ago that I had filed away under things people say when they don't mean them. He said he wasn't able to watch someone he loved go through something like this. He said it would destroy him. He said it was better to do this now, cleanly, rather than later, when it would be messier for everyone. He said he hoped I could understand. I want to stop here and give you the translation of what he said because the translation matters. When he said he wasn't built for this, he meant he wasn't willing. When he said it would destroy him, he meant he had decided his comfort was the organizing principle of the situation. When he said it was better to do it now, cleanly, he meant it was better for him. Better to be legally unattached before the medical bills mounted, before caregiving became a reality, before whatever time I had left could make claims on him. When he said he hoped I could understand, he meant he hoped I would make this easy. I stood in the hallway of my own house. I had driven home by then, autopilot, muscle memory. I barely remembered the drive. And I held the phone and I looked at the wall across from me, which had a framed photo on it from our trip to the coast 4 summers ago. Michael and Cooper on the beach, both of them squinting into the sun. Cooper mid-laugh at something his father had just said. I had taken that photo. It was a good photo. I said one thing before I hung up. I said, "I want you to know that I'm going to be fine." He started to say something, and I said it again, more clearly. "I am going to be fine, Michael. And I need you to think about what it's going to mean for you when that turns out to be true." Then I ended the call. I sat down on the hallway floor with my back against the wall, and I put the phone face down on the hardwood beside me. Down the hall, I could hear the sound of the refrigerator running. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere a few streets over, someone was mowing their lawn, the drone of it distant and oddly comforting. Ellie and Cooper were at school. They would be home at 3:15. I had 2 hours and 40 minutes. I did the math automatically, the way a mother always does. Time until they arrive, what I need to have figured out before then. I was not going to let my children come home to a mother who had been destroyed by a phone call. I was not going to let them walk in the door and find me on the floor. I sat there for a few more minutes because I needed to, and then I got up. I went to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I found my address book. Paper, old-fashioned, the kind my mother had always kept. And I looked up the name of a woman my friend Linda had mentioned once, a family attorney she described as the kind of person you want in your corner when the other side thinks they have already won. Her name was Patricia Hollis. I left a voicemail. I gave my name and my number, and I said, "My husband has retained counsel and filed for divorce. I have a recent cancer diagnosis. I need someone who is going to take this seriously." I made tea. I drank it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the backyard, the swing set Michael had put up 3 summers ago, the garden bed I had been meaning to expand, the ordinary, accumulated evidence of a life we had built. At 3:15, Cooper and Ellie came through the front door. Cooper dropped his backpack in the entryway, exactly where I had asked him 100 times not to drop it. Ellie had a drawing she'd made at school that she wanted to show me immediately, before her shoes were even off. I looked at the drawing. I said it was wonderful, because it was. I picked up the backpack and put it on the hook by the door without saying anything about it. I started on an after-school snack. I was their mother, and I was still standing, and that was going to have to be enough for today. Tomorrow, I would figure out the rest. Here is something nobody tells you about being left during a medical crisis. They tell you it's cruel, and it is. They tell you it's statistically more common than people want to admit, and it is. Studies show that women with serious illness are significantly more likely to be left by their partners than men in the same situation. And if that number hits you like something between outrage and dark recognition, you are not alone. But what nobody tells you about is the logistics. The immediate, grinding, suffocating logistics of being left. Because grief is one thing. Grief you can carry. You carry it with you to the grocery store and to your kids' school pickups and to the chair in the infusion center where they run the first round of labs. Grief fits in your pockets. What does not fit in your pockets is the sudden realization 3 days after your husband retains a lawyer that the health insurance you have been on for 6 years is through his employer's plan. And that employer's plan is going to become a very complicated conversation very quickly. I found this out from Patricia Hollis on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after the notification. She called me back the day after I left the voicemail, which told me something about her before we had even spoken at length. We met in her office, second floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of office with real plants on the windowsill rather than the fake ones designed to reassure. And she sat across from me and asked questions in the precise, unhurried way of someone who has heard a lot of stories and has learned that the details are where the truth lives. I told her everything. The timeline, the diagnosis, the 7 days, the phone call, the dinner party comment from 3 years ago that I had filed away and was now retrieving with the clarity of hindsight. She listened without interrupting. She wrote things on a yellow legal pad, the same kind Michael used, which I noticed and then set aside because I was not going to let that derail me. When I finished, she put her pen down and asked 2 questions. The first was about the business. She asked how much of the operational structure I had contributed to, and in what capacity, and whether any of that had been formalized in writing. The second was about the timeline of symptoms. She asked when I had first noticed something wrong and whether Michael had been aware of those early signs before the formal diagnosis. I told her about February, the fatigue, the first blood work. I told her he had been the one to push me back to the doctor in April. She nodded slowly and wrote something down and then said, without elaborating, that she would like to request the complete financial records for the business going back 18 months. I asked her why 18 months specifically. She said she would explain when she had something to explain. She was not a person who speculated out loud, which I respected even when it was frustrating. In the meantime, the practical catastrophe had to be managed. The insurance situation was the most urgent. A friend connected me with a patient advocate, a woman named Sandra who worked for the hospital system and whose entire job was helping people navigate exactly this kind of administrative cliff edge. Sandra was calm in the way that people who spend their days handling genuine emergencies become calm. Not detached, but grounded, like someone who has learned that panic is a luxury that doesn't actually help. She found a COBRA continuation option that would cover me through the divorce proceedings. It was expensive. It was also the difference between treatment and no treatment, so the cost was not a conversation I was capable of having with myself. The other conversation I could not put off was the one with my children. Cooper was 11. Ellie was 8. They knew I was sick. Michael and I had told them that together, on day 2, in the vague and careful language you use with children when you are trying to protect them from a truth that is too large for them to fully hold. But they didn't know about the divorce yet. They didn't know that the family shape they had grown up inside was about to change, permanently. I told them on a Saturday morning. I had thought about the right moment for 3 days, which is the wrong way to approach it. There is no right moment for this conversation. There is only the moment you choose. We were in the living room, the 3 of us. I had not turned on the television. I had made hot chocolate, which was maybe a form of instinctual preparation, giving their hands something to hold. I told them their dad and I were going to be living separately. I told them this wasn't because of anything they had done or anything they could have changed. I told them they would see their dad regularly and that he loved them, both of which were true to the best of my knowledge. And I held on to those truths with both hands because they were the ones that mattered most in that room. Cooper looked at his mug for a long moment and then asked, "Is this because you're sick?" I want to tell you how that question landed because I think you need to know. 11 years old, looking at his hot chocolate, asking the question that cut directly to the thing I had been trying to figure out how to say. I said, "Dad and I have been having some problems for a while, and being sick made some things clearer for both of us." That is the truest version of a complicated answer that I could give an 11-year-old, and it is the version I stand behind even now. Ellie climbed into my lap. She didn't say anything. She just positioned herself there with the matter-of-fact certainty of an 8-year-old who has decided that proximity is the appropriate response. And she was not wrong. I held her and looked at Cooper over the top of her head. And he looked back at me with the specific expression of a child who is deciding in real time how much of what he's feeling he's going to let you see. He looked very much, in that moment, like his father. And I loved him so absolutely that it made my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the diagnosis. That was the worst conversation. Everything after it was hard in different ways, but that was the worst. Linda, my friend Linda, who had known me since we were 23, showed up on my doorstep the following Wednesday with 3 bags of groceries and a casserole dish, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. She did not ask if she could come in. She came in. She put the groceries away with the familiar efficiency of someone who has spent enough time in your kitchen to know where things go. And then she sat down across from me at the table and she said, "I need you to tell me what you actually need, not what you're managing, what you need." I told her. I needed someone to take the kids on Thursday afternoons when I had treatment. I needed someone who would answer the phone at 11 at night when the insomnia got bad, which it did, regularly. I needed someone who would not look at me with the particular expression, a mixture of pity and protective distance, that I had already started seeing on the faces of people who heard the word cancer and began quietly revising their relationship with me. Linda said okay to all of it. She said it the way my mother had once said it, directly, without the word loan, without the implication of debt. Just, okay, I will do those things. I have thought a lot in the months since about what it means to be left and what it means to be stayed with. Michael left. He left with a reason that made sense to him, inside a logic that was entirely self-referential. And I am not going to tell you I understand it, because I don't. I understand the mechanics of it, the fear, the self-preservation, the calculation. But I don't understand how a person does the arithmetic on someone they have loved for 11 years and comes up with that answer. But Linda stayed. Sandra stayed, professionally, but she stayed. Patricia Hollis stayed. Dr. Wren stayed. And gradually, I began to understand something that the previous years of my life had not fully taught me. That the people who stay during the worst thing are not necessarily the people you expected. They're the people who, when handed the same door Michael was handed, looked at it and chose differently. That knowledge did not make the loss smaller, but it made the room I was in feel less empty. I want to tell you what chemotherapy is actually like, because I think the way it's represented as a single dramatic experience, a montage of suffering followed by a montage of recovery, does a disservice to the people who go through it and to the people who love them. It is not a montage. It is a schedule. It is every other Tuesday, and it is a chair, and it is a bag on a pole and a needle, and a room full of other people in their own chairs, each of them inside their own version of this. And the strange, specific intimacy of sharing a room with people who are all, in their different ways, fighting for something. My infusion center was on the 4th floor of the hospital. The chairs were a neutral blue-gray that someone had probably chosen for its calming properties. The windows looked out over a parking structure, which was not exactly inspiring. But there was one corner of the parking structure where a tree had managed to grow up through a crack in the concrete. And I looked at that tree every Tuesday for 7 months. And it became, in the way that small things become large things when you are paying the kind of attention that illness forces on you, something I genuinely looked forward to seeing. The nurse who ran my line on most Tuesdays was named Dorothy. She was in her 50s, efficient and warm in equal measure, And she had a habit of bringing warm blankets without being asked, just appearing at the start of a session with one folded over her arm, as if she had already assessed the situation and made the appropriate decision. I cannot explain to you how much that meant. Small, consistent, unrequested kindness is a different category of thing than grand gestures. And in that period of my life, it was the former that kept me going. I read during infusions. I also slept, and I also sat and thought, which was something I had historically been bad at, sitting without doing, but which illness had forced on me as a kind of curriculum. You learn things, sitting still with a needle in your arm and nowhere to be for the next 4 hours. You learn what you actually think, as opposed to what you have been telling yourself you think. The distinction, it turned out, was significant. What I thought, sitting in that blue-gray chair, was that I had spent 11 years making myself useful to a life that was not organized around me. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way of stories where the protagonist is obviously mistreated. In a quiet way. In the way that a person who is good at managing things gradually becomes the person who manages everything. And the structure settles into place so gradually that nobody, including that person, fully registers how lopsided it has become. I had run the operational back end of Michael's business for years. I had managed our household, our children's schedules, our social calendar. I had been the person who remembered the pediatrician appointments and the permission slips and which of Cooper's friends had a nut allergy. I had done all of this not resentfully, I want to be clear about that, but automatically, because I was good at it and because the alternative was things not getting done, and I was not capable of watching things not get done. What I had not fully reckoned with was that all of that capacity, all of that organizational intelligence, had been flowing in one direction for a very long time. And Michael had built his life around the assumption that it always would. Patricia Hollis called me on a Thursday in my second month of treatment. She had the financial records. Her voice, when she told me what she had found, was the same careful, unhurried voice she always used. But there was something underneath it. Not quite satisfaction, but the specific tone of a person who has been looking for something and found it. Over the 18 months prior to my diagnosis, significant funds had been moved out of the business through a series of transactions that were, individually taken in isolation, explainable. Vendor payments, contractor fees, consulting expenses. But taken together, viewed as a pattern, they described a picture that Patricia said she would need a forensic accountant to fully document, but that was already legible to her. I asked her what it meant in plain terms. She said, "It means money that belonged to both of you was being moved into structures that belonged only to him. And it means that this process appears to have begun approximately 10 months before your diagnosis." 10 months before my diagnosis was February of the previous year. February was when I had gone to the doctor about the fatigue. February was when the first blood work had been run. February was not when I was diagnosed. February was before the imaging, before Dr. Wren, before any of us had a name for what was wrong with me. I sat with that timeline for a long moment. The implication was not subtle. Michael had known, or suspected, or feared, before I did. And whatever he had suspected had been enough to make him start preparing. Not for my treatment, not for the possibility of my recovery, for the possibility that I would not recover, and what that would mean for the financial arrangements. I want to be very precise here, because precision matters. I am not saying he knew I had cancer in February. I am saying that something about my health, about the visible changes in me during those months was legible to him in a way that prompted action. And the action he took was not to encourage me to see a doctor sooner. The action he took was financial. I told Dr. Wren about this at my next appointment, not the legal details, just that I was managing some significant additional stress. She nodded and asked where I was putting the stress, which is the kind of question that sounds simple and isn't. I told her I was putting it into anger, mostly. She said that anger, clinically speaking, was a reasonable response to what I was describing, and that patients who were able to access their anger, as opposed to those who turned it inward, tended to tolerate treatment better. She said it professionally, neutrally. Then she looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, "So use it." I did. I will tell you that without hesitation or qualification. The anger became fuel, and the fuel became clarity, and the clarity became the energy I brought to every conversation with Patricia, to every document I reviewed, to every decision about what I was going to fight for and how hard. I was not going to be someone who had been left for dead and then politely accepted whatever was offered. I was going to be someone who arrived at the other end of this, one way or another, and I was going to arrive with what was rightfully mine. The forensic accountant's name was James Kowalski. He was a quiet man with the kind of methodical attention to detail that manifests as a physical stillness. He moved slowly, spoke slowly, never seemed rushed, and produced work that was precise in a way that made opposing attorneys visibly uncomfortable. Patricia had used him before. She described him, in her understated way, as someone who is very good at reading numbers the way other people read sentences, for what they're saying between the lines. What James found, over the course of 6 weeks, was a story told entirely in transactions. It was not a dramatic story, the way financial fraud is sometimes portrayed, not elaborate shell companies or offshore accounts or the cinematic apparatus of sophisticated theft. It was quieter than that. It was a series of ordinary-looking decisions that, in aggregate, described a man who had been systematically redirecting shared assets into personal holdings for the better part of a year. Vendor payments to entities that did not appear in any business registry, consulting fees paid to an LLC that had been incorporated 8 months prior with a registered agent address in another state, equipment purchases logged as business expenses that Patricia's team could not locate any physical evidence of. The amounts were not enormous individually, never large enough in any single transaction to trigger immediate scrutiny, but the pattern, across 18 months, represented a substantial sum, a sum that was supposed to be part of our shared marital estate. Michael's attorney, a man named Brian Caldwell, who was polished in a way that had clearly taken effort and money to achieve, argued that these were legitimate business decisions made by the sole managing partner. He argued that my involvement in the business had been informal and advisory, and not sufficient to constitute a legal ownership stake. He argued that the timing of the transactions was coincidental. Patricia let him finish. She had a way of letting people finish that was not passive. It was the particular patience of someone who is allowing rope to be used. When he was done, she presented James's report, all 47 pages of it, with the timeline laid out in a column that showed, month by month, the trajectory of the transfers mapped against my medical history. The judge asked Michael's attorney a direct question about the LLC. Brian Caldwell said he would need to consult with his client before responding. The judge said he could do that at recess, and she would expect an answer when they returned. They returned with a modified position. I was not in the courtroom for all of it. Some of it was handled between attorneys in a way that my presence was not required for, and Dr. Wren had been clear that I needed to be managing my stress levels, which was an instruction I was doing my imperfect best to follow. But Patricia called me after each session. She reported, without embellishment, without false reassurance, without the kind of softening that can be a kindness in the short term and a disservice in the long one. She called after the day Caldwell's position shifted and said, "They are now willing to acknowledge a more substantial marital interest in the business." I asked what that meant. She said it meant they had looked at James's report and concluded that a judge who saw what that report showed was not going to be sympathetic to their original position. It meant we were going to get more than they had initially planned to give. It meant Michael's calculation had been wrong. He had calculated, I believe, that I would either not survive long enough for the proceedings to conclude, or that illness would make me too depleted to fight effectively, or that the combination of those two factors would produce a settlement I would accept because I was too tired and too frightened to do otherwise. He was a man who planned, who organized, who looked at situations and identified the most efficient path through them. He had applied that same logic to our divorce, and he had arrived at what seemed, from the inside of his own reasoning, like a sound conclusion. What he had not factored in was Patricia Hollis, or James Kowalski, or the anger that Dr. Wren told me to use, or the fact that I had, sitting in a blue-gray chair in an infusion center for 7 months, become a woman who was done being underestimated. The final settlement took 3 months to finalize. I received a significant share of the business valuation, calculated using the corrected financials rather than the ones Michael had originally presented. I received the house, which we had jointly owned and which Cooper and Ellie had grown up in, and which I was not going to uproot them from on top of everything else. I received a support arrangement that reflected the actual financial history of our marriage rather than the version Michael had been constructing. On the day the papers were signed, Patricia and I sat in her office afterward, and she poured 2 small glasses of something from a bottle in her desk drawer. Good whiskey, as it turned out, which I would not have predicted about her. And she said, "You held up well." I said, I wasn't sure that was true. She said, "Holding up doesn't mean not feeling it. It means continuing anyway." I drank the whiskey. It burned in the specific way good whiskey burns, and outside her window, the city was doing its ordinary afternoon things, and I was alive, and the papers were signed, and it was over. It was not over, of course. The parts that are really over are always smaller than you expect, and the parts that continue are always larger. But that chapter was done. 11 months after Dr. Wren used the words aggressive malignancy, I sat in the same chair in her office, the same chair where Michael had sat beside me and held my hand and said, "We'll get through this." And I waited for her to finish reviewing the imaging results. She reviewed them for longer than usual. This is a thing that oncologists do that patients learn to read, the way you learn to read any language you are immersed in long enough. The speed of review means something. Too fast, and you wonder if they missed something. The right amount of time feels neutral, professional. Longer than expected can go in either direction, and those seconds of not knowing which direction are the longest seconds I have ever sat through. She set the images down. She looked at me over her glasses. She said, "The scans are showing a significant positive response to treatment. No evidence of active progression." The language we'd use at this point is early remission. I have tried, many times since then, to describe what that moment felt like. I have not found language that is fully adequate. What I can tell you is that it was not the way moments like that are depicted. not tears, not sudden release, not the swelling emotion of a film scene. It was quieter than that. It was the specific feeling of a breath you have been holding for 11 months, finally, slowly releasing. Not all at once, just gradually, like pressure equalizing. I said, "Okay." She said there was still monitoring to do, still follow-up imaging at regular intervals, still the understanding that remission was not a guarantee and that vigilance remained necessary. She said all of this clearly, and I listened to all of it clearly, because I had learned over 11 months to receive medical information as information, not as verdict, not as sentence, but as data that helped me understand what came next. That shift in how I related to information about my own body was one of the things the past year had given me. Linda was in the waiting room. I had asked her to come, which was unusual. I had generally gone to appointments alone, partly from habit and partly because there is a specific self-sufficiency that develops when you get used to navigating things without a hand to hold. But this one, I had not wanted to navigate alone. I walked out into the waiting room, and she stood up and looked at my face. And before I said anything, she was already moving toward me. I told her what Dr. Wren had said. She held on to me for a long time without speaking, which was the right thing. Which was exactly the right thing. We went to lunch afterward. A restaurant nearby, nothing special, a booth by the window. We ordered food that we mostly picked at because neither of us was particularly hungry, in the way that neither of you is hungry when you are too full of something else. We talked about ordinary things, her daughter's school play, a book she'd been reading, whether the booth we were sitting in had always been this uncomfortable, or whether we'd both just gotten less tolerant of uncomfortable booths. We laughed at that last part, and the laugh was real. And it was the realest thing I had felt in months. At some point, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "I need you to know that I never, not once, prepared myself for you not making it." She paused. "I know some people do that. I know some people say it's protective. I just couldn't do it." I told her I was glad she couldn't. She said, "I was furious at him. I want you to know that. I still am." I told her I understood. I told her I had been furious too. I told her I thought the fury had probably helped, and Dr. Wren thought so too, and that I was trying now to figure out what I was going to do with it now that the thing that had been feeding it was resolved. She said that was a problem she was happy I had. On the drive home, I thought about what the past 11 months had actually been. Not the version I might tell quickly. The diagnosis, the betrayal, the legal battle, the remission, the tidy arc of a story that has a beginning and a middle and an end. The real version, which was messier and quieter and more granular than any summary. The Tuesday infusion sessions with Dorothy and the blanket. The forensic accountant's 47 pages. Cooper doing his homework at the kitchen table while I was too exhausted to cook and ordering pizza for the 3rd time that week, and him not saying a word about it. Ellie, who had started climbing into my bed in the middle of the night with the instinctive radar of an 8-year-old who understands more than she has language for. Patricia and her desk drawer whiskey. Sandra and her calm navigation of the insurance cliff. The tree growing up through the crack in the parking structure concrete. All the small, structural things that had held me up when the large thing I had expected to hold me up had walked away. I pulled into my driveway. The house was mine. The evening light was doing something complicated with the maple tree in the front yard, the way it does in November. Low and gold, and almost too much to look at directly. I sat in the car for a moment before going in. I was alive. I was home. Those two facts, placed next to each other, were enough. For that moment, they were exactly enough. I want to tell you where I am now, because stories like this sometimes end at the dramatic moment, the remission, the settlement, the final scene, and leave you without a sense of what the after actually looks like. The after is not a montage. The after is also a schedule. It's just a different one. I am 14 months out from the diagnosis. I am 8 months into remission. I have follow-up imaging every 3 months, which I treat as a recurring calendar event with the same matter-of-fact relationship I have developed toward all medical information. It is data, and data is useful, and I am not going to spend the weeks before each scan in a state of anticipatory dread. I have mostly succeeded at that. Not entirely, but mostly. Cooper is 12 now. He has his father's eyes, and increasingly his father's height, which means he is going to be taller than me by next year, and he finds this endlessly entertaining. He has started asking better questions than he used to. Not the careful, protective questions of a child trying not to upset you, but the genuine, curious questions of someone who has decided you are a person worth knowing. We talk on the drive to school on the mornings I take him. Not always about important things. Sometimes about baseball statistics, which he cares about deeply, and I care about only insofar as they are language he wants to share with me. I have learned enough to hold up my end. Ellie is 9. She is still a person who responds to difficulty with proximity, who comes to find you when something is wrong rather than withdrawing, which is a quality I hope she keeps her whole life. She has recently become interested in baking, which has resulted in a kitchen that is frequently covered in flour and a refrigerator that contains more experimental muffins than we can reasonably consume. I eat every single one. Some of them are genuinely excellent. She is undeterred by the ones that aren't. Michael sees them every other weekend and one weeknight. By all accounts, he shows up. He does the scheduled things, the pickup and the drop-off, the occasional school event, the birthday acknowledgments. Whether he is present in the ways that matter, in the ways that are harder to schedule, I do not know. That is between him and his children, and I have made a deliberate choice not to be the intermediary for it. My job is to be their mother. His job is to figure out how to be their father. Those are separate jobs. He sent me a text message 4 months after the remission. Just one. No preamble, no explanation, no attempt to contextualize or justify anything that had come before. It said, "I'm glad you're okay." I read it twice. I thought about it for 2 days. I did not respond. Not because I wanted to hurt him. I don't, and I want to be honest about that, because wanting to hurt him would require a continued investment in his significance in my life that I have found I am not willing to make. I didn't respond because there was nothing in that message that required a response from me. He was glad. That was his feeling to have. It didn't need anything from me to be valid. What I think about when I think about him now, and I think about him less than you might expect, is not the divorce filing. It is the dinner party. The night 3 years before any of this, when he said, across a table full of people with champagne and good intentions, that he wasn't built for illness, for hospitals, for the long vigil of loving someone through something terrible. I think about all the people at that table who laughed, including me. I think about the ways we give people full information about who they are and then are surprised when they act on it. I am not surprised now. I am not surprised, and I am not angry in the consuming way I was during treatment. And I am not sad in the way that I was in the early months when the loss of the marriage felt like a wound that might not close. What I am is clear. The way you are clear when the fever finally breaks and you can see the room again. I go to therapy every other Thursday. My therapist's name is Dr. Rachel Odom, and she has a ficus plant in the corner that she clearly loves very much and takes excellent care of, which I consider a reasonable indicator of character. She does not tell me how to feel. She asks questions and then waits for me to find my own way to the answers, which is a form of respect I did not know I needed until I experienced it. I have continued freelance operations consulting, which I started during treatment as a way of rebuilding something of my own, and which has grown into something real. I work with small business owners who are navigating scaling problems. Ironically, exactly the kind of operational work I spent years doing informally for Michael's business. The difference is that now it has my name on it. Now it is mine. The business is not large. It is not going to make me wealthy in any dramatic way, but it is built from things I know how to do, things that were always mine even when they were flowing in someone else's direction. And there is a specific satisfaction in that, in recognizing the tools you already had and understanding, finally, that they were always yours to use. I want to leave you with something before I close this out, because I think about the people who are listening to this story from inside something difficult. From inside a diagnosis, or an abandonment, or the specific and disorienting experience of being left when you needed most to be stayed with. I want you to hear this clearly. Being left is not evidence that you were not worth staying for. I want to say that again because I think it's the thing most likely to get lost, the thing that the difficult months try hardest to erode. Being left is not evidence that you were not worth staying for. It is evidence of the limits of the person who left. Those are different things. The person who is unable to stay during the worst version of your life is telling you something real and important about themselves. They are not telling you something real and important about you. Michael could not stay. That was not about my value. That was about the ceiling of his capacity. And I am not responsible for that ceiling. And neither, if you are in something similar, are you responsible for the ceiling of whoever left you. What I have learned, what I have earned the right to say, is that illness shows you the architecture of your life. It takes everything that was decorative, that was performative, that was maintained for appearance rather than substance, and it strips it. What's left is structural. And sometimes what's left is smaller than you expected. And sometimes it's stronger. I had Linda. I had Patricia. I had Dorothy and her warm blankets, and Dr. Wren and her direct eyes, and Sandra, who navigated the insurance cliff without ever making me feel like a problem. I had Cooper doing homework at the kitchen table, and Ellie's experimental muffins, and a tree growing through concrete in a hospital parking structure. That is not nothing. That is not a small life. That is a life made of things that held. If you are in the middle of something right now, if you are in the part of the story that doesn't feel like it has an after yet, I want you to look at what is holding, not what has fallen away. What is holding? Because that is the structure. That is what you are going to build from. My name is Laura. My daughter made blueberry muffins this morning, and they were genuinely excellent. And she is 9 years old, and I am alive to eat them. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story found you somewhere real, If you recognized a feeling, a moment, a kind of silence you've sat in, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want to hear the story of a woman who discovered, the day after her mother's funeral, that she had been written out of the will in favor of a sister who hadn't spoken to their mother in 6 years, that story is in the description below. Take care of yourselves. And remember, the people who counted you out were working with incomplete information. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.